In the quiet suburbs of Lexington, Kentucky, where family homes lined the streets and neighbors often waved from their porches, Thomas and Elena Whitaker appeared to be just another ordinary couple living out the promise of the American dream. The Whitakers had moved into their modest two-story house on Maplewood Drive in the spring of 2018. To most people, they seemed perfectly happy. Thomas, a 38-year-old mechanic with a strong build and quiet demeanor, and Elena, his 34-year-old wife who worked as a receptionist at a local dental clinic. Their lives blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the neighborhood, filled with the familiar sounds of lawnmowers in summer, children playing in the park, and the distant hum of traffic along the interstate. Thomas was known as a man who worked hard and rarely took days off. His co-workers at the auto shop often described him as dependable, though not particularly social. He preferred to keep to himself, speaking only when necessary. Some thought of him as a reserved man, the type who carried his own burdens silently. Elena, on the other hand, carried a warmth that immediately drew people in. She greeted her neighbors with a friendly smile, often stopping for short conversations as she walked her dog in the evenings. To those who knew her, Elena was polite, kind-hearted, and perhaps a bit private. Even her closest friends admitted that she rarely talked about her past. Their marriage, at least to outsiders, seemed stable. They attended community barbecues together, went shopping on weekends, and occasionally took short trips out of town. There were no visible cracks in their relationship, no shouting matches in public, and no rumors spreading among neighbors. In the small suburban circle where appearances meant everything, the Whitakers gave no reason for suspicion. Yet beneath this calm surface, Elena carried a truth she had not shared with her husband. Before meeting Thomas, Elena had lived a very different life. Born in Louisville, Kentucky, she grew up in a strict household where expectations weighed heavily on her. From an early age, she struggled with her identity, always feeling as though she was living in a body that did not align with her true self. In her 20s, Elena made the life-changing decision to transition. It was not an easy process, financially, emotionally, or socially, but it was a choice that gave her a chance to live authentically. By the time she met Thomas at a mutual friends gathering in 2015, Elena had already completed her transition and was determined to leave her past behind. For Elena, keeping her history private was not about deceit but about survival. She had faced prejudice before, and the fear of rejection haunted her. When she fell in love with Thomas, she believed that revealing the truth might destroy the fragile happiness she had finally found. She convinced herself that what mattered most was the love they shared in the present, not the past she had endured. So, when their relationship grew serious and eventually led to marriage in 2017, Elena chose silence. Thomas, unaware of Elena's past, entered the marriage with trust. He believed he knew the woman he married completely. To him, Elena was simply the person who made his life brighter after years of solitude. But deep down, Thomas carried insecurities of his own. He had grown up in a conservative household, where traditional values were not just taught but expected. Though he rarely spoke of it, his upbringing shaped how he viewed relationships and identity. For a man like Thomas, trust and honesty were not just important, they were absolute. As the years went by, Elena's secret remained hidden. She lived in constant tension, hoping the truth would never surface. Every time she filed away old papers or medical documents, her hands trembled at the thought of Thomas stumbling upon them. She told herself that as long as she was careful, the secret would remain buried. But life, as it often does, had other plans. By the summer of 2021, cracks began to show in the Whitakers' seemingly peaceful marriage. Thomas had started drinking more often, and Elena noticed his temper flare at small inconveniences. Though he never laid a hand on her, his words sometimes carried an edge that left her uneasy. Still, Elena tried to keep the peace, brushing off the tension as the stress of work and bills. In her heart, she feared what might happen if Thomas ever uncovered the truth. This hidden tension, wrapped in the fabric of their ordinary suburban life, would soon unravel into tragedy. What began as a quiet love story in the heart of Kentucky would spiral into a chilling crime that shocked not only their community but also the wider public once the details emerged. And it all started with a secret Elena thought she had buried forever. On the surface, the Whitakers blended in seamlessly with their neighborhood on Maplewood Drive. By the summer of 2021, they had been living there for 3 years, long enough for neighbors to know them by name but not long enough for anyone to truly understand who they were behind closed doors. Life in Lexington, Kentucky, moved at a slower pace compared to larger cities, and people often valued privacy as much as friendliness. Neighbors exchanged polite greetings, borrowed sugar now and then, and kept to their routines without prying too deeply into one another's affairs. For Thomas Whitaker, that quiet environment was perfect. He left for the auto shop at 7 every morning, wearing grease-stained work shirts and carrying his lunch in a brown paper bag. His routine rarely changed: fix cars all day, chat briefly with coworkers, and return home just after 6. He often came home smelling of motor oil, his hands scarred from years of working with tools. Though reserved, Thomas valued the stability of routine and the familiarity of small-town life. He had grown up in Kentucky and never saw much reason to leave. Elena, in contrast, carried a different rhythm in her daily life. She worked as a receptionist at Lexington Family Dental, about 15 minutes away from their home. Her job was steady, not glamorous, but it suited her. She was the first face patients saw when they entered, and her warm smile often put nervous patients at ease. Her co-workers described her as friendly but somewhat private. She rarely discussed her personal life, even during lunch breaks when the office gossip circled the room. She listened politely, laughed when expected, and redirected conversations whenever they drifted toward deeper questions about her past. Together, Thomas and Elena lived an outwardly ordinary life. They went grocery shopping every Saturday morning at Kroger, paid their bills on time, and sometimes hosted casual dinners for a few friends. Photographs of their wedding day still hung on the walls. A modest ceremony held in the fall of 2017 at a small church in Louisville. To guests who had attended, it was a joyful day. Elena in her ivory gown, Thomas in a simple black suit, both smiling as they exchanged vows under the soft glow of candlelight. Nothing about that day hinted at the storm that would one day consume their lives. Yet there were subtle signs, small details only visible to those paying close attention. Thomas, for all his steadiness, often grew impatient over minor things. A misplaced set of keys, a dinner not ready when he expected it, a conversation that strayed too long. Elena usually diffused these moments with gentle words, but each one chipped away at the fragile peace in their marriage. To outsiders, they still seemed like any other couple balancing the demands of adulthood, but Elena knew the tension was slowly growing. The truth that Elena carried weighed heavily on her shoulders. Every night, when she lay beside Thomas, she wondered what he would say if he knew. Would he still love her? Would he walk away? Or worse, would he see her not as the woman he had married but as someone who had betrayed him? The fear never left her. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the way she double-checked that her old documents were hidden, in the way she carefully avoided questions about her childhood. By the fall of 2021, Elena's past was closer to being exposed than she realized. In the cluttered attic of their home sat an old box of papers, medical records, letters, and photographs from a life she had tried to leave behind. The box had remained untouched for years, but it was only a matter of time before Thomas stumbled across it. The Whitakers' marriage was, in many ways, built on love but shadowed by silence. Elena believed silence was protection. Thomas believed silence was absence of truth. That difference in values, invisible at first, would soon collide with devastating consequences. In November 2021, tensions between them became more visible. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices late at night, though they couldn't make out the words. One neighbor, Mrs. Harper, mentioned seeing Elena sitting alone on the porch one evening, her face pale and her hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. It was unusual. Elena rarely smoked. When asked about it later, she had brushed it off with a smile, claiming she was just tired from work. Thomas, meanwhile, began drinking more heavily. Coworkers at the auto shop noticed he seemed distracted, quicker to anger when a job went wrong. He didn't talk about his marriage, but there was a heaviness about him, a kind of simmering frustration that hadn't been there before. All of these small details, the late-night arguments, the secret box in the attic, the changes in their behavior, were puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. In time, they would reveal the darker truth of the Whitakers' marriage and the fatal night that would shock the entire community. For now, though, to those who only glanced from the outside, Thomas and Elena were just another couple navigating life in Kentucky. Their story, however, was anything but ordinary. It was a story of love overshadowed by secrets, of trust shattered by silence, and of a hidden truth that, once revealed, would set in motion a tragedy no one could undo. It was the evening of December 3, 2021, a Friday that had started out like any other for the Whitakers. The early winter air in Lexington carried a chill, and holiday decorations were beginning to appear on the porches of Maplewood Drive. Inside the Whitaker home, Elena had spent the afternoon tidying the living room, stringing a few lights around the window, and setting aside boxes of ornaments for the Christmas tree they planned to decorate over the weekend. Thomas, however, came home in a sour mood. Work at the auto shop had been frustrating, and he had lingered too long at the bar with co-workers before driving home. By the time he stepped through the front door just after 7 p.m., the faint smell of alcohol followed him. Elena noticed his mood instantly. She greeted him with a soft, "Welcome home," but he only muttered in response. The tension between them had been building for weeks, and Elena tried as always to smooth it over. She set dinner on the table, roast chicken, potatoes, and green beans, but Thomas barely touched his plate. He sat in silence, his jaw tight, until finally excusing himself to head upstairs. In the quiet of the bedroom, Thomas pulled down the attic ladder to grab an old box of holiday decorations. It was a chore he disliked, but Elena had asked him earlier that week to help bring down the boxes so they could start decorating. Grumbling under his breath, Thomas climbed up into the dim attic space, the wooden boards creaking beneath his weight. Dust hung in the air as he shifted boxes around, searching for the one labeled Christmas. As he pulled one box forward, another slid slightly to the side, revealing a smaller container tucked in the corner. The lid was partially open, and inside were folders and envelopes instead of ornaments. Curious, Thomas set aside the larger box and reached for the smaller one. At first, he thought nothing of it, just old paperwork Elena had stored away. But as he flipped through the contents, his eyes caught on something that made his stomach turn. It was a medical record. His wife's name, Elena Marie Whitaker, was printed clearly at the top, but the details below left him frozen. The document, dated 2012, described procedures and treatments that Thomas had never known about. There were words he could not ignore: gender reassignment surgery, hormone therapy, transition. Confused, he pulled out another envelope, then another. Each paper told the same story, each revealing a past that Elena had never shared. For several minutes, Thomas simply sat in the dim attic light, staring at the records in disbelief. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories, searching for explanations that would make sense of what he was seeing. He remembered the way Elena avoided questions about her childhood, the guarded way she spoke about her past. He had dismissed it at the time as a sign of a difficult upbringing. But now the truth hit him with the force of betrayal. When he finally climbed down from the attic, papers clutched in his hands, his heart was pounding. He stormed into the living room, where Elena sat folding laundry on the couch. She looked up, startled by the expression on his face. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, his voice sharp and loud as he thrust the documents toward her. Elena's face drained of color. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the paper she had tried so carefully to hide. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again as if the words wouldn't form. "Answer me," Thomas shouted, his hands trembling with rage. "Is this true? Did you lie to me this whole time?" Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She set the laundry aside and tried to steady her voice. "Thomas, please. I wanted to tell you. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd leave me, afraid you'd hate me. I'm still the same woman you fell in love with. Nothing about me has changed." But her words only fueled his anger. To Thomas, everything had changed. His mind was consumed with the idea that his marriage had been built on a lie. Years of conservative upbringing and rigid ideas about identity collided violently with the reality before him. "You tricked me," he hissed. "You made me a fool in front of everyone. All this time, lying." Elena reached for his arm, desperate to calm him. "No, Thomas, please. I love you. I've always loved you. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted us to have a chance." He yanked his arm away, pacing the room like a man cornered. The anger in his chest burned hotter with each passing second, fueled by alcohol and the weight of betrayal. The silence of the house, broken only by Elena's sobs, pressed in on him. He felt as though his world had been shattered, his trust destroyed beyond repair. What began as a confrontation quickly escalated into a heated argument that stretched late into the night. Voices rose, words sharpened, and the distance between them grew wider with every exchange. Elena begged for understanding, repeating that she was the same person he had always known. But Thomas no longer saw his wife, he saw deception. At one point, Elena tried to leave the room hoping to give them both space to calm down, but Thomas blocked her path. His chest heaved with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get to walk away from this," he spat. "You don't get to just lie to me and think I'll forgive you." The argument spiraled out of control, circling the same words again and again. Truth, lies, betrayal, fear. The clock ticked past midnight, the tension in the air heavy and suffocating. For Elena, the moment she had dreaded for years had arrived, and it was worse than she had ever imagined. For Thomas, the discovery felt like the breaking point of his entire life. By the early hours of December 4, 2021, nothing in the Whitaker home would ever be the same again. What had started as the uncovering of a secret had ignited a storm of anger and pain, setting in motion the events that would lead to tragedy. The morning of December 4, 2021, dawned cold and gray in Lexington, Kentucky. By 6:45 a.m., the quiet neighborhood of Maplewood Drive was disrupted by the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers. A frantic 911 call had come in just before sunrise, Thomas Whitaker reporting that his wife, Elena, had been found unresponsive in their living room. His voice on the recording was shaky, desperate, almost incoherent as he told the dispatcher that something terrible had happened. When first responders arrived, they found Elena lying on the floor near the couch, her body limp and pale. Thomas was crouched beside her, his face buried in his hands, muttering that he didn't know what had gone wrong. Paramedics rushed in, but it was too late. At 7:12 a.m., Elena Whitaker was officially pronounced dead. The initial scene was confusing. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks, no evidence that anyone had come into the house. The living room appeared tidy at first glance, though detectives noticed details that stood out. A coffee mug knocked over on the floor, a blanket bunched up unnaturally, and faint red marks around Elena's neck. Detective Carla Jensen, a seasoned officer with the Lexington Police Department, was among the first investigators on site. She had worked homicide for nearly a decade and immediately sensed that the situation didn't align with Thomas's version of events. "What happened here, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked calmly, notebook in hand. Thomas, his voice strained, explained that he had woken up early to find Elena on the floor. He claimed he had no idea what had happened, suggesting maybe she had collapsed in the night from a medical issue. His eyes darted around the room, and his words often faltered, as if he were piecing the story together on the spot. Jensen noted his demeanor, grief-stricken, yes, but also strangely defensive. "Did she have any health problems? Heart conditions? Anything like that?" she pressed. Thomas shook his head. "No, nothing. She was healthy. I don't know, maybe stress. I don't know." The paramedics, however, had already quietly informed Jensen of their observations. The bruising on Elena's neck did not resemble a natural cause of death. It was more consistent with pressure applied by force. By mid-morning, the Whitaker home had been sealed as a potential crime scene. Crime scene technicians began photographing every corner, bagging items for evidence and collecting samples. The living room carpet bore faint impressions, as if a struggle had taken place, though nothing appeared outright destroyed. The small details, the misplaced items, the bruising, the tension in Thomas's story, suggested more than just a tragic accident. Neighbors, curious about the commotion, gathered outside their homes. Most were shocked. Elena was well-liked, friendly, always polite. To them, the Whitakers seemed like a couple who kept to themselves but never caused trouble. When officers knocked on doors to gather preliminary statements, a few neighbors admitted hearing raised voices the night before. One recalled the argument continuing late, long past midnight, though they hadn't been able to make out the words. Another said she saw Elena sitting outside earlier in the week, visibly upset, but didn't think much of it at the time. At the police station later that day, Detective Jensen and her partner, Detective Marcus Hall, conducted an official interview with Thomas. He sat slouched in the chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He repeated the same story. He had gone to bed after midnight, woken up at dawn, and found his wife on the floor. He claimed he tried to shake her awake, then called 911 when she didn't respond. But as the detectives pressed, cracks began to show. When asked what they had done the night before, Thomas hesitated. He admitted they had argued, but insisted it was nothing serious. When Jensen asked about what the argument was about, Thomas avoided eye contact, mumbling something about holiday stress and money issues. Meanwhile, the coroner began the autopsy at the Fayette County Medical Examiner's office. Preliminary findings were troubling. There were clear signs of strangulation. The bruising on Elena's neck, the fractured cartilage, and the burst capillaries in her eyes all pointed to manual force. There were no underlying health conditions that could explain her sudden death. When this information was relayed back to detectives, suspicion around Thomas deepened. He was the only person in the house at the time, there were no signs of a break-in, and the neighbors had confirmed hearing an intense argument. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning toward domestic homicide. Still, detectives knew they needed more than suspicion. They began digging into the Whitakers' background. Credit card records, phone logs, and text messages were subpoenaed. Elena's co-workers at the dental clinic were interviewed. One colleague mentioned that Elena had seemed distracted lately, often lost in thought, though she never said why. Another remembered Elena confiding once, in hushed tones, that she feared Thomas would never forgive her if he ever discovered something about her past. The co-worker admitted she didn't understand what Elena meant at the time, but the memory now seemed chilling. By the evening of December 4th, the case had already shifted from a medical mystery to a likely homicide investigation. Thomas was not arrested immediately. Detectives wanted to build a stronger case, but he was firmly established as the prime suspect. In the quiet of the police station hallway, Detective Jensen remarked to her partner, "This wasn't random. This was personal. Whoever did this knew her, and I think we both know who that is." The stage was set for a deeper investigation, one that would uncover not only the events of that fatal night but also the hidden truths that had been buried within the Whitakers' marriage for years. The investigation into Elena Whitaker's death moved quickly, but just as detectives felt they were beginning to understand what had happened, new information shifted the direction of the case entirely. What began as a straightforward domestic homicide suddenly revealed layers of secrets and motives far more complicated than anyone expected. On December 6, 2021, 2 days after Elena's body was discovered, the Fayette County Medical Examiner's office finalized its report. The official cause of death was listed as manual strangulation. There was no ambiguity. Elena had been killed by someone's hands, and the injuries were consistent with sustained pressure applied during a violent struggle. Detective Carla Jensen now had confirmation of what she already suspected, but the next step was determining why. That same day, Jensen and her partner, Detective Hall, executed a search warrant on the Whitaker home. While combing through the attic, Hall stumbled across a box of old documents. Inside were medical records, court papers, and letters that told a story no one outside of Elena's closest circle had ever known. The records revealed that years earlier, Elena had undergone gender reassignment surgery. It was a deeply personal history she had never shared publicly. When the detectives reviewed these documents, the case took an unexpected turn. The papers were meticulously stored but partially disturbed, suggesting someone had gone through them recently. Hall looked at Jensen, his expression grim. "This is it," he said. "This might be the trigger." The discovery reframed the investigation. What if Thomas had found the documents? What if the heated argument neighbors heard on the night of December 3rd was connected to this revelation? Suddenly, the motive wasn't just a marital dispute, it was betrayal, secrecy, and identity colliding in a marriage already under strain. The detectives began re-interviewing witnesses, this time with new questions. When asked if Elena had ever mentioned her past, her co-workers shook their heads, but one recalled Elena appearing unusually anxious during the weeks leading up to her death. A neighbor, Mrs. Harper, told police she had seen Elena crying on the porch just 3 nights before the tragedy, muttering to herself as if rehearsing something. "It was like she was preparing to confess something," Mrs. Harper explained. The detectives then turned their focus back to Thomas. When confronted with the information from the documents, Thomas's demeanor changed. At first, he denied knowing anything about them. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said sharply, but his eyes betrayed him. After hours of questioning, his story began to unravel. He admitted he had gone into the attic the night before Elena's death to retrieve Christmas decorations. He reluctantly acknowledged finding some papers, though he insisted he didn't fully understand what they meant. But detectives knew better. The timing was too precise. The discovery of the documents, the loud argument overheard by neighbors, and Elena's sudden death all within the same night. As suspicions mounted, forensic analysts delivered another critical finding. traces of Elena's skin cells were discovered under Thomas's fingernails. It was evidence consistent with her fighting back during the strangulation. Combined with the autopsy report, the physical evidence left little room for alternative explanations. Yet the case still held a twist. While reviewing Elena's personal files, detectives found a handwritten letter tucked inside one of the folders. It appeared to be addressed to Thomas, though it had never been given to him. In it, Elena explained her past in her own words, her struggles, her transition, and her fear of rejection. She wrote about her love for Thomas and her hope that one day she would find the courage to tell him everything. The letter painted a heartbreaking picture. Elena had not intended to deceive Thomas forever. She had simply been paralyzed by fear of losing him. For Jensen, reading the letter shifted her perspective. This was not just a homicide, it was the tragic collapse of a marriage where silence and secrets proved fatal. When the detectives presented this evidence to the district attorney, the case strengthened dramatically. They now had motive, opportunity, and physical evidence tying Thomas to the crime. Still, the emotional complexity of the case made it stand out. It wasn't simply about violence, it was about identity, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrecy. By December 10, 2021, Thomas was brought in for a second formal interrogation. This time, the detectives laid everything on the table. The autopsy results, the neighbor testimonies, the medical documents, the letter, and the forensic findings. Under mounting pressure, Thomas's carefully constructed story collapsed. Slamming his fist on the table, he shouted, "She lied to me. For years she lied. Do you know what that feels like? To wake up and realize your whole marriage is a sham." His voice cracked, filled with anger but also anguish. Detective Jensen remained calm. "Thomas, your wife was still the woman you married. She loved you. She trusted you enough to stay even with her fear. But you took her life instead of choosing to understand." The room fell silent. Thomas slumped back in his chair, breathing heavily, no longer able to deny the truth. For the investigators, this was the turning point. The motive was clear. Thomas had discovered Elena's past, confronted her, and in a fit of rage, killed her. But as the case moved closer to trial, the question lingered, was this a crime of passion fueled by betrayal, or was it a premeditated act driven by prejudice? The answer would determine how the law judged him, but for Elena, the outcome could no longer be changed. The arrest of Thomas Whitaker on December 12, 2021 was the moment when the investigation shifted from suspicion to full-scale prosecution. Detectives Jensen and Hall had spent long days collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the tragic night. Now, Thomas was officially charged with second-degree murder. The courtroom battle that followed became the stage for the story's climax, where both sides fought to define not only Thomas's actions but also Elena's life. The arraignment took place at the Fayette County Courthouse in Lexington, Kentucky. On that cold morning, reporters crowded the steps, their cameras pointed toward the courthouse doors. The case had already attracted national attention because of the sensitive revelations about Elena's identity and Thomas's alleged motive. Headlines described the tragedy as a domestic murder fueled by a hidden truth. Some media outlets painted Thomas as a heartless killer, while others cast him as a man pushed past his breaking point. Inside the courtroom, Thomas appeared pale and defeated, wearing the orange jumpsuit of the Fayette County Detention Center. He stood beside his defense attorney, Michael Harmon, who immediately entered a plea of not guilty on his client's behalf. Across the aisle sat the prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel McKinney, a sharp and relentless prosecutor known for her empathy toward victims of domestic violence. From the start, the prosecution framed the case as a story of trust betrayed and life unjustly taken. McKinney laid out the evidence: the autopsy confirming strangulation, the scratches on Thomas's arms, the skin cells under his fingernails, the medical documents in the attic, and the heartbreaking letter Elena had written but never delivered. "This was not an accident," McKinney declared. "This was a choice, a violent act committed in anger when the defendant discovered a truth he could not accept." The defense countered with a different narrative. Harmon argued that Thomas had acted in the heat of passion after being confronted with a life-altering revelation. "My client is not a monster," Harmon told the jury. "He was a man overwhelmed by shock and betrayal. This was not planned. This was not premeditated. This was a tragic reaction to a secret that never should have been kept from him." The courtroom drama escalated when witnesses were called. Neighbors testified about the loud argument on the night of December 3rd. Mrs. Harper, the elderly woman who lived next door, described hearing Elena's voice raised in desperation, followed by a sudden silence. It was like the life was sucked out of the house, she told the jury, her voice trembling. Forensic experts presented photographs of Elena's injuries, including the bruises on her neck and the defensive wounds on her arms. The images were difficult to look at. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. McKinney used these moments to drive home the brutality of the crime, emphasizing how long it would have taken for Elena to lose consciousness. The defense in turn focused on Thomas's state of mind. Harmon called a psychologist to the stand, who testified about the psychological impact of sudden life-changing revelations in intimate relationships. The expert suggested that Thomas's actions could have been the result of a temporary loss of control rather than calculated intent. The strategy was clear: reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter, sparing Thomas from a life sentence. Tension reached its peak when Thomas himself took the stand. At first, his voice was steady as he described his marriage to Elena. He spoke about their vacations, their dinners at local restaurants, and the way she laughed when she watched old sitcoms. But when McKinney pressed him about the night of December 3rd, his composure began to crack. "I confronted her," Thomas admitted. "I asked her if it was true. She tried to explain, but I couldn't hear it. I felt like everything I knew about her, about us, was a lie. I snapped." His voice broke, and for the first time the jury saw a flicker of remorse. But McKinney seized on his words. "You snapped," she repeated sharply. "And instead of walking away, instead of seeking help, you wrapped your hands around your wife's throat and took her life. Isn't that right, Mr. Whitaker?" Thomas's silence was louder than any admission. The trial stretched over 2 weeks, each day peeling back more layers of the marriage. Elena's friends testified about her kindness, her resilience, and the fear she had carried about revealing her past. One coworker recalled Elena confiding, "I just hope he'll love me enough to stay when he knows." That single sentence hung heavy in the courtroom, underscoring the tragedy of her death. As the case neared its end, both sides delivered powerful closing arguments. McKinney stood before the jury and held up Elena's letter. "This is a woman who loved her husband enough to stay silent, even when the truth ate away at her. She didn't deceive him to hurt him. She stayed silent out of fear. And for that she paid with her life. Justice demands accountability." Harmon, on the other hand, appealed to the jury's sense of humanity. "Thomas Whitaker is guilty of losing control. He is guilty of making a terrible, irreversible mistake. But he is not guilty of cold-blooded murder. You must see the difference." By the time the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the courthouse was palpable. Reporters gathered outside, waiting for the verdict. The public was divided. Some saw Thomas as a man consumed by prejudice, others as a victim of unbearable emotional shock. Whatever the jury decided, one truth was undeniable: Elena's life had been stolen, and no verdict could restore what had been lost. On December 23, 2021, after 2 days of tense deliberation, the jury finally returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Reporters filled the benches, and Elena's friends sat shoulder to shoulder, holding hands for strength. Thomas Whitaker stood at the defense table, his head bowed, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. When the foreman rose and delivered the verdict, the words echoed across the silent room: "Guilty of second-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Thomas closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of his actions had finally crushed him. Across the aisle, tears streamed down the faces of Elena's friends, who whispered her name as if to honor her in that moment. Judge William Carter addressed the courtroom with solemn gravity. "This case has revealed not only the tragedy of a life cut short but also the pain of secrets and the destructive power of violence." The court sentences Thomas Whitaker to 30 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 25. The gavel struck and the case was closed. In the days that followed, news outlets across the nation reported on the trial. Some focused on the tragic dynamics of the Whitakers' marriage, while others highlighted the broader social questions it raised. Editorials debated whether Elena had been wrong to keep her past hidden or whether Thomas's reaction exposed deeper issues of prejudice and intolerance. For many, the case became more than just a murder trial. It was a reflection of society's struggle with love, identity, and acceptance. For Detective Carla Jensen, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but nothing could erase the image of Elena's handwritten letter. She often thought of Elena's words, her plea for understanding, her fear of rejection, and her unshakable love for the man who would ultimately end her life. To Jensen, the letter was more than evidence. It was a reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of silence. Meanwhile, life in Lexington, Kentucky slowly returned to normal. The Whitaker house stood empty, its windows dark, a silent monument to the storm that had unfolded within its walls. Neighbors who once waved to Thomas and Elena as they tended their yard now passed by quietly, their glances filled with unease. As Thomas began his sentence at the Kentucky State Reformatory, Elena's friends organized a memorial service in her honor. Held on January 15, 2022 at a small community church, the service drew dozens who wanted to remember her not for the manner of her death but for the warmth of her life. They spoke of her kindness, her laughter, and her courage to live authentically, even if fear had kept her from fully revealing her past. A candle was lit in her memory, and as the flame flickered, those gathered whispered the same message: Elena deserved better. In the end, the case of Thomas and Elena Whitaker was not only the story of a murder but a cautionary tale about love, truth, and the devastating cost of secrecy. It left behind unanswered questions and heavy hearts, but also a legacy, one that urged people to choose compassion over judgment, honesty over silence, and understanding over fear. And though Elena was gone, her story would live on, a reminder etched into the history of Fayette County that behind every secret lies a truth powerful enough to change lives forever.